Alex Moss, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Good to be here.
So we've known each other. I've known your company for a long time, but we were just talking, and it's you founded about 14 years ago a security company. Is it formerly Conventus and now North Star, or maybe give us a little of your background and how that all evolved?
Sure. It is North Star now. We started as Conventus, which again, as a business owner, you know how challenging it can be to
Yeah,
find a name as you
yeah,
start. The fortunate thing was we got a bit of a do-over, and the primary reason was we were started as a consulting business and then transformed into a software company. So North Star was the name of the internal code name for this project that we
sure,
started out of one of our consulting practices, and then it evolved and wound up evolving our entire business.
yeah.
So
Well, it's amazing because as a lot of consulting companies I know of, that's the grass is greener over there on product land. So congratulations to you. I'm sure lots of people are envious of that transition.
thank you. It
Yeah,
was it was difficult. It There was a lot of challenges that were introduced, and you hear the analogies of kind of it's turning a ship or whatever. I always said, the bus is going around a really sharp corner. Everybody's got to hold on, and the ones
yeah,
that the pieces that can't hold on aren't gonna make it as part of this of what our business is going to be.
yeah.
But
That's a great analogy. I mean, frankly, the turning of the battleship metaphor, now that you mention it, has always seemed sort of very peaceful and just that's a nice, slow, gradual turn. It is
yeah.
not that at all. I love the movie Speed comes to mind. You're turning a bus
Yeah,
on a corner.
there
I
you
love it.
go.
That's fantastic. Well, the reason that I want to talk to you is that kind of thinking about your specialty and your company's specialty in security and cybersecurity, that there might be some interesting things that maybe people aren't aware of, or things that like CEOs should pay attention to. And I gave you the challenge of what are three things that people should focus on. And I love how you framed it. There's sort of two that we've all known about, and a third which maybe makes sense in a black swan kind of way after you said it, but maybe not a lot of people are paying attention to. So maybe let's go through those and then dig deeper into how they play out.
Sure. And again, everybody's lens is going to be different. So there's
Yeah,
no single answer, particularly in security, right?
sure.
But what I'd say is how I've kind of always looked at it at a very high level is protection, right? Is the first key thing that everybody looks for is, you know, what are the things I need to do to implement controls and protection within my environment? You go back to the early days where it was just antivirus and firewalls, right,
Right.
was kind of the core of, and that's where you started to see kind of the emergence of security as a discipline. And people assigned within IT is saying, okay, now you're security people. Now, again, larger companies and more uh, technology-driven companies were probably earlier than the rest of us, but most businesses, started in the mid 90s of having to kind of address basic protection.
Mm.
Um, and that's a deep well, right? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on there, and it's where, security budgets and security time is a lot of time is spent. And then the second one is, well, did you want to go deeper into that one?
No, Leah, let's hear because I think the interesting one is your third because that's really where the meat
Okay,
is. So let's do the first two and then we'll go deeper on the third.
sure. And then regulatory and compliance, right? We all got hit with SOX and then HIPAA, and
Yep.
then started seeing PCI and uh, NERC SIP for the folks that are in the power industry, and we started seeing a lot of regulatory requirements that were born out of, I'll call it the lack of protection, right? These
Right.
regulating bodies said, hey, you need to start. Um, these are the minimum things you need to do from a protection standpoint or from an audit standpoint to make sure that you're not putting things in jeopardy.
Hmm.
Um, and so that was an area that, again, grew very, it got importance because it was mandated.
Yeah. Sure.
There was
Sure.
no ifs,
That
ands, or
helps.
buts. You're going to do it.
Yeah.
So it was easy to, I'm not going to say it was easy to justify the spend, but it very quickly became a requirement, and it is what it is. This is what we're going to have to do.
Hmm.
The quality at which people could do it, quality maybe not the best word, but the level of effort that organizations expend on it certainly varies. But that's going to depend on a lot of times on the impact of violation of those requirements, of the regulatory and compliance requirements.
Yeah. And those are, I think, as I was saying earlier, those are things we all are aware of, and in some way have interacted with probably on a pretty regular basis for a while. But I think you kind of have this idea about kind of how security impacts the business. It seems like there's a lot there. So I wonder if you maybe spell that out, and then we can go deeper on that one.
Sure, it's as security has matured, right, and it's constantly evolving. It's one of the things that we're seeing more and more is that, and as in our consulting practice, one of the things that we always focused on was understanding what the requirements were and where they were born, and then understanding why is one thing more important than another.
Hmm.
And really, it came down to beginning to look at how um, technology relates to the business, why things exist, why are they there, how are they
Hmm.
enabling the business. We were in an internal conversation earlier today. One of our long-term guys who was a consultant in the compliance space before, and now he's on the software side. He said he first learned about the importance of business. One of his first lessons was when he worked at an amusement park when he was a teenager, and they were complaining because their squeegees broke, their window squeegees,
Yeah.
and they told their boss, and he's like, "Squeegees don't make money, so deal with it."
Yeah.
And that was, in simplest terms, you move that into a more mature environment, and it becomes important to understand, what are the things that are important to the business? Are we, you know, are we manufacturing uh, cereal, right?
Yeah.
Or are we providing electricity, right? And what's the technology that's supporting those core functions of the business? Um, and those were kind of basic, but I'll give you one that was a bit more nuanced. We
Sure.
worked with a customer years ago in the banking space, and they had a line of business that what they did was they packaged mortgage products and essentially sold them.
Hmm.
So they would put together, hundreds of consumer mortgages and sell it as a product. And they had an application that was essentially like a trading floor, a commodity trading floor for them, where I say people, entities were bidding on
Yeah.
these products. That application went down, people got in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
But if you didn't know, right, it's just another server, it's just another piece of
Yeah.
software running. But the relevance of that technology stack to their business was critical.
Yeah. Well, you bring up the point about like understanding what's more important and sort of what are the squeegees and what are the what are the what's the money maker, the
Ticket
the
sales, right? In
tickets,
the
right?
amusement park
Right.
analogy, it's
Yeah.
the kiosk where they can sell the tickets.
Right, and I always find them because we're in the custom software space that when you talk about what it costs to build something, it's treated like a commodity, or it's you're buying 100 tons of steel or whatever. But when you talk about the risk of losing a market that's a $50 million market, or to your point, the risk of that application sounds like it's $1 million a minute lost. So the cost, if you really want to talk about the cost of keeping the security infrastructure in place, is you can look at it as a cost, or you can look at it as how to not lose $1 million a minute. Is that kind of the framing?
Yeah, absolutely, right. It can equate, and I get very opinionated when it comes to equating a dollar value to technology,
Hmm.
particularly in security, right? It's one of the things that people have said, and we've seen in software products where they'll say, "Oh, this application is worth $1 million a minute." Well, from a security perspective, my first question is that per incident? Is it per hour? Is
Yeah.
it cumulative? If I have two machines or two entirely different business applications involved, is it additive? Is it exponential? Like
Right.
it's hard to it begins to get very hard to quantify those into numbers and communicate those up the stack, because ultimately what you're trying to do is say, here's where we're at risk, and quantify it. Let me restate, communicate that in a way that leadership understands, whether
Mm,
leadership is someone at a director or a VP level,
sure.
all the way up to the board. Because again, if you look at that um, mortgage application, the that's something that you could the board would understand. They are looking at the profit that's derived from that product that they're selling, and they understand if that's put at risk. I mean, you said you recognize it very quickly. You're not even
Yeah.
in the banking space, and you said, "Wow, it sounds like if that goes down, that's
Yeah.
a lot of money per minute." That the board is going to understand the maybe not the hourly impact, but certainly the quarterly and annual impact that that
Yeah.
business service has.
Well, and it's funny you even brought up, and there's a cumulative effect, but there's also, if it's down for 1,000 or 5,000 minutes in a row, maybe you're just out of business. There's like you can get pretty extreme with like it doesn't just add up linearly. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, and then you look at there's ones that are, and there's in the middle, right? You look at the volume of breaches that we've had over the years.
Mhm.
I shouldn't say the volume. Look at the breaches that we've had over the years and the ones that haven't put companies out of business, but have cost them a tremendous amount of money.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well,
in
that
some,
that Target one's pretty famous with the HVAC vendor. Are there other big stories that come to mind for you that you sort of use when you're telling your story?
the well, in our industry, here's what I'll say. I'm not there's FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Okay.
It's the it's kind of the worst way to sell security technology,
Mm.
right? And we see it all the time. So I want to
Yeah.
be very careful with what I'm about to go
Okay.
into. And a lot of
Sure.
FUD relates to saying, "Oh, look at what happened to these folks." So I want to caveat that for people that are listening and know that I'm
Okay.
not a huge fan of throwing people under the bus or trying to scare people.
Yeah.
Um, but the big ones over the years, Target, obviously, Equifax, um, and Equifax brings up kind of an excellent example of understanding where technology was putting their business at risk. In that
Mm.
example, a simple, and I say that carefully, a
Yeah.
simple or relatively simplistic vulnerability was on a key application that had access to customer data that
Mhm.
was internet facing.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was in a hostile environment. It had their crown jewels, and when you look at Equifax, their business is customer data. That's
Yeah.
what they do. No, it didn't. Obviously, didn't put them out of business, but it cost them a lot of money, um, a lot of effort, certainly impact to their reputation. It's going to be a long time before anyone forgets what
Yeah.
happened to Equifax. And
Well, so if you're to reframe this in a non-FUD, whatever the opposite of FUD is, like how do you like to frame it in a way that you think is more productive?
so it's um, in the I would kind of break it into pieces, right? And if the first is understanding how technology is putting your business at risk,
Mhm.
because it's very personal, right, to each of these companies. We can give examples, right, and share but the key is understanding what's important to your individual business and how do you gain visibility there to understand where technology is potentially putting that
Hmm.
portion of your business at risk. Um, and when I say business, right, that's a kind of a generic term,
Yeah.
but again, it's that portion of your business, that segment, because we all have to do a whole bunch of things. I mean, the if if you imagined your life before you started your company versus the reality of what it is today, there's probably a lot of things that you do that you had no idea you would be doing.
Right. We're both smiling because it's a lot. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of extra stuff. And
Yeah.
it may be stuff that you don't want to do and don't want to focus on, but you have to.
Sure.
It has to be done. And then security, when you're looking at security, you can kind of frame it in that same way. It's like if the things that you care about, that you know are important to your business, protect those at all. I'm not
Mhm.
going to say at all costs, but focus your efforts there. And then as you're scaling down, supporting operations, right? The things that you need to do to run your business. But if they're down a day, a week, maybe even a month, you'll survive. You'll be
Yeah.
fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's going to
Yeah.
cause a little bit of pain and it'll a heartache, but it's not going to crush you, right?
Mhm.
And it's not going to put your core business at risk.
Yeah. Well, what about you talk about here, we're looking at our notes here about kind of where um, business applications relating to the line of business and software relating to business applications. Talk about that sort of layer of getting into the underlying problem there.
Yeah, and if you go a step higher, it's always inventory, right?
Hmm.
The things you have, right? It's taking stock of the technology that you have. And in those notes, the example, what we always want to do, and kind of, again, some of it'll sound like the holy grail from an inventory standpoint, but it's, I don't care about an individual server, right? It's technology, it's hardware, it's
Right.
applications, it's configuration, and that's it. What I care about is that business service and I use the term business application because it's a grouping of services that are providing something that's enabling a portion of the
Right.
business,
Right.
right? And then so that business application, that grouping of stuff is software, hardware, and infrastructure, other supporting elements, right? And so if I can then understand, if I can look at a line of business and then I can understand what applications are enabling that line of business, I can then begin to understand, get better granularity into where each individual technology component is
Right.
putting those services at risk, rather than trying to look at a whole bunch of servers and saying, okay, here's 100 servers, and here's the exposures or vulnerabilities they have, and which one should I fix? It
Right.
it gets very hard. But if I just look at, say, okay, here's my core, here's the business services that matter most to me, and then underneath that, then I'm grouping those technologies underneath that. Then I can say, okay, here's the things that really are going to get me in trouble.
Right. And so what makes that inventory so hard?
There, so what we found over the years is it's inventory typically is something that's owned by IT. Um, Gartner's calling it INO, I think is their new term, and I can't remember what that stands for. Uh, Infrastructure, network, and operations, I think is what that stands for. But I call it kind of IT ops, right? And so when you look at their inventory, the primary reason that IT cares about inventory is kind of old school classic, right? I've
Hmm.
got new hardware in, it's
Yeah.
got a depreciation, it's got a life and a depreciation schedule, and I've got to get it in, and then I've got to get it out, right? And I got to know who
Right.
owns it and all
Yeah.
those things. But security doesn't care about the life cycle; it cares about now. Like I care
Hmm.
about everything that's on the wire. And I'll give you a real example. Again, another customer. Um, we pulled information from their CMDB, which is where most people are storing their inventories, whether you're using something like ServiceNow or Tivoli or Altiris, whatever it is. Um, you pull inventory from those systems, or in this example, what we did was we pulled inventory, and there was a lot of things that were labeled as decommissioned. And you think of,
Mm.
but what we found was that those things were still on the wire. So if
Oh,
they're on the wire in the environment, that's still security risk. There's things
yeah.
that could happen, right? And you look at how the folks that, and I say help desk, but the people in those areas are, their performance is measured as typically the rate of ticket closure, right?
Mm. True.
And so if you have someone that's measured by that from a performance standpoint, and the last step is to unplug it, unrack it, and put it on a pallet to be shipped for recycling, or in the case of a VM, just powering it off, even as simple
Yeah.
as powering it off, let alone deleting it or purging it. Um, they we found a significant volume of things
Mm.
that were labeled as decommissioned, but were still active. Some things were still providing service to the business as well.
Wow.
They
Wow.
weren't technically decommissioned, but their life cycle had ended according to their schedule. So they worked through the process, but just failed to finish those final steps
Wow.
of getting it out.
Wow. That's funny. Yeah, that is kind of a perverse incentive where if you're incentivized to close the ticket, but part of the ticket is to get up and go over there and do something, you might just say, "Yeah, I'm done. I'm moving on to the next ticket. That one's
Yeah.
closed." Because it seems harmless. I think part of what we're talking about is there's some things that that people are aware of, and that maybe here's something they would have ignored and said, "Well, what's the problem with having a decommissioned server out there? We're not using it." But then again, now that you think about it, yeah, that's a black swan problem.
Yep. And then you get, then, that's it. I'll call that kind of an old school problem. Then you move into the new school, which
Yeah,
is elastic services, right? And cloud enabled services.
sure.
And you have, not only do you have, let's call it servers or virtual server, virtual devices spinning up and down to meet demand, but you have containers that are
Yeah.
coming and going as well. And again, those are resources that provide services that also can contain exposures and put the
Hmm.
business at risk. So maintaining those inventories becomes increasingly difficult, right? And there is a difference between a container, a dormant container, and an active container, right?
Yeah.
So knowing you could have one that's on the wire and active, but you could have, and that's certainly more important than one that's kind of sitting dormant waiting to spin up. If I'm gonna do one thing, like if I'm gonna put out one fire, I'm gonna put out the fire that that is active versus the one that could start sometime soon. So, but again, it's all that information. It's really, it's just like a lot of what we're doing from a technology standpoint. It's using more data.
Mm.
Give me more data elements that I can use to make solid decisions. And
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to. So,
So what are some things so if you're listening to this and you're in a business that has a lot of these potential vulnerabilities, you're thinking to yourself, what should I do next? Alex, what should I do next? Like what's a way to sort of assess and then put a plan together to get it to mitigate what you might have out there?
well, the good news is there's a couple of approaches that have kind of come out in the last few years. And one is, and they all relate to data, right? It's using data. And I'll put it into two categories. There's technical risk and then there's business risk, right?
Mhm.
Now, ideally, we're using both of those and finding the intersection of technical
Right.
risk and business risk. But we talked about at a baseline, understanding the business and building that inventory and keeping it accurate and up to date, near real time
Yeah.
can be a challenge. But something that's easy for people to do out of the gate is to use threat information to prioritize vulnerabilities. And I'll throw out
Hmm.
a couple of quick numbers.
Okay.
In an
Great.
average organization that has about 25,000 assets, they'll likely have well over 1 million vulnerabilities, unique instances of a vulnerability on a machine. And most machines, you can have anywhere from, I'm not going to say zero, but you could have 10 to 100, right,
Mhm.
on an individual device. And when you look at those, a vulnerability, there's a relationship. A vulnerability is a weakness, right? And an exploit is a thing that takes advantage of that weakness. Not every vulnerability has an exploit.
Hmm.
So then if I could separate those out, that's one thing that I can do very quickly is I can separate out, okay, if no one ever has even figured out how to exploit it, I'm going to put that very low on my list,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then if I take those things where an exploit exists and I can break that into a couple of categories, I can say, okay, an exploit exists and someone has used it in the wild at some point.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's another shockingly big division. You can push a whole lot of things over to the side because an exploit exists, but no one's ever figured out how to use it.
Hmm.
Um, and then when you look at those where someone's actively used it, then you can break it down and even a little further, and you can say, well, which ones are attackers currently using, right?
Hmm.
What's been used and what's been seen in the wild in the last 90 days, right? And we kind of refer to that as imminent risk, right? It's not absolute, right? But it's the probability that you could face that issue is about as high as you can get.
Right.
And you can do that without kind of any of the understanding any of the what we call business risk. But then if you're able to get some basic things, right? So I won't go to Nirvana, but I'll go to kind of the basic things like let's take regulatory and compliance, right?
Hmm.
I mentioned that as kind of a second thing we have to
Yeah.
deal with.
Sure.
Well, if I can add in and I can say, of all the things in my environment, let me prioritize anything that falls under a regulatory or compliance requirement higher than the other things. It's kind of
Hmm.
an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
You already have that inventory because you're getting audited on it. So use that information. And then you can start digging a little deeper, kind of chunking things out and saying, okay, what do we know that's very important? And then just kind of adding those individual data elements into what you're focusing on so that the goal is that, and what we found, right, in most orgs, you're going to have more problems than you have time to fix.
Yeah.
So if I've got 100 things to do and I only have time and resources to do 10 of them, how do I make sure that I'm doing the right 10 things? And again, I'll equate this to the business owner side.
Hmm.
We have more than 100 things we need to do,
Sure.
and we cannot do them all, right? You
Yeah.
don't have an infinite pile of money or pile of resources to throw at all the things that you want to do or that you need
Yeah.
to do. So you have to pick the things that are going to make the biggest impact.
Right. And
Um,
is it fair to say, I mean, you could never have 100% coverage on 100% of the inventory, and it's about prioritizing where you're most likely to have a problem on the biggest business risk? Is that a way to?
Unfortunately, we're finding
Yeah.
that's true,
Yeah.
right? It's no, the smaller the organization, the more likely they are. Like if you have, you know, 200 employees, odds are it's a solvable problem.
Hmm.
But you get to 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, the volume of things that exist in those environments and the requirements, the the the, the processes that evolve around
Yeah.
those make it untenable.
Right. There's so
Um,
many different interactions, and just it sort of multiplies the number of possible ways
yep.
things can go wrong. Yeah.
And
Um,
I'll give you one of the other kind of ironies that we see,
yeah.
and it I shouldn't say it makes me laugh because it sounds unsympathetic, but it's truly ironic when you think about patching, right? Because a patch fixes things, or it fixes a lot
Yeah.
of cases fixes vulnerabilities, among other things. But anybody that's done patching or worked in that space knows that in a large environment, you can't just deploy patch to every device, right?
Yeah.
If it's, and the reason is because patches can break things.
Hmm.
And so typically organizations have an exception process in place, right? And more often than not, the application owners, those business application owners, are the ones who file the exceptions, right? That say, don't patch my
Don't
stuff,
touch mine. Yeah, I don't want mine
right?
down. Yeah.
And if you had to guess, who would you suggest is gonna, or what would be the most common attribute of the people that don't want their stuff patched?
Probably non-technical people that just want their business unit up.
in the high value
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So go back to that wholesale mortgage application. They're
Yeah.
never going to want to get patched because if it goes down, they're in trouble.
Right.
Everybody's in trouble,
Right.
right? But that's the most high value thing. And so that's the irony we found is that exceptions tend to exist more frequently on high value
Uh, which are the ones
resources.
that should be the ones we're paying attention to, because if they go down, right? So they're playing the game of I'd rather have it up and not be in trouble for the risk of it being down. And if it goes down, they're not even going to. It's almost like they're in denial about the fact that it could go down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there was an instance where we were working with a customer and it was around patching, and there was a couple of different groups that were reporting in to a single individual and reporting in their patching levels, and they were saying on a monthly basis they were reporting in that their patching was well above 90% complete. So they were saying I'm
Hmm.
93% complete, I'm 98% complete, I'm 97, whatever. Well, then we started pulling the data and we found that one was in the 70s and the other two were in the low 80s.
Yeah.
And again, this environment had tens of thousands of servers and hundreds of thousands of endpoints. So it was very large in scale. And the primary difference was when they were reporting 90%, they weren't including exceptions.
Yeah.
So they
That's what I
were
was going to say.
saying,
I
we're
bet they're skipping those.
90%
Yeah.
of the people that will let us patch.
Yeah. Right.
So it
Well,
looks good, but that risk is not gone. It's
yeah.
accepted, right? So it's still there, but the person that accepted it, to your point a minute ago, is they're typically not technical.
Yeah.
They're responsible for a business function
Yeah.
and
So
providing that business function.
so maybe as a parting thought here, I mean, that sounds like a really, really valuable conversation to have and be successful in. So, if someone's listening to this going, oh man, I know exactly what system we need to look at in our org and no one's going to let me near it. What are some ways or a story or framing you think you could be successful in winning that business unit over?
Getting the person to fix their issue, is that what
Yeah,
you're asking?
saying okay, yes, come and maybe we'll get if there's going to be an hour downtime at midnight on Sunday, you can do it because I understand how important this is.
This is kind of hard, right? And this is where you start to get into the politics, right? We've all dealt
Yeah,
with politics, but this is one where again you think you're dealing with someone in security, so way down the stack, so to speak, talking to someone that's far down an entirely different stack.
yeah,
And the closest that they may meet, their reporting structures may meet, is at the CEO level, right?
interesting. Yeah, yeah, I
Right?
can see what you're saying. Sure.
Because again, think of that finance example I gave. The person that's in that business that's responsible for those things probably doesn't report up through IT. They're reporting
Mhm.
up through finance, right,
Right,
or
right.
operations, right, and so really it starts to come down to accountability, and security teams need to get very good at communicating risk, right, and risk acceptance, because those individuals need to that accountability needs to be understood, right? So
Hmm.
this individual and being able to say, hey, this business group, this whether it's a line of business or a business application owner or whoever it is, here's the aggregate risk that they're accepting.
Yeah,
And acceptance is doesn't mean it goes away. It means they're accepting this risk to the business. And you go to some of those previous examples that happened in the real world, and those folks may not understand the impact
hmm,
of their acceptance, the potential impact of their acceptance. And unfortunately, right, what we see is if a breach occurs, the CISO bears the weight of that
right,
responsibility, even though
right,
someone else
right.
accepted the risk,
Yeah,
and that end the CISO doesn't have good visibility into that acceptance because of kind of the
yeah,
communication channels and the processes that exist underneath them, or whatever. So anyway, I gave you a long kind of
No, it's great. I
answer.
mean, it sounds like in a way that role could get handcuffed if they don't have visibility and sort of ability to tell the right kind of story to those branches of the org that they don't have direct
Yep.
influence over.
And it's not, and when you go up to that level, it's not saying, oh, it's not giving technical details. It's not
Mhm.
saying this CVE ID or
Right.
this person has these 100 things. It can be as simple as saying there's issues on that server that attackers are using in the wild
Yeah.
actively in campaigns, and
And they're going to
it's
find
on
us.
one of
They're
our
going to
core
find us eventually.
applications. How do we fix that one issue?
Hmm.
Because it could take down a key part of our business.
Right.
And that's something that can be understood at the C level.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, so this has been great. I really appreciate going through some of these framings about security. I know I picked up a few ideas and tricks myself. That's great. Thanks for being on. I'd love to have you on again sometime, and we'll go into one of these a little bit deeper again.
You bet.
You made it all the way to the end. Thanks. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video to hear more content just like this.